run through a little update on the Unwanted Horse Coalition, but before I do that, I want to bring you all up to speed on the issue because perhaps some of you aren't aware of it. And unlike some of the issues we talked about this morning, this is one issue that the more you know about it, the more difficult the solutions become, rather than the more you know about it, the easier they become, right? I had a meeting a while back, Morse Animal Foundation sponsored, and we had a lot of small animal people there, and we went through the issue, and they had a lot of quick cures, but horses aren't dogs and they're not cats, and this is a lot different issue. So let's quickly go through what started all this, the unwanted horse issue back in 2000, 2001 in Europe and Great Britain. There were BSE outbreaks and foot and mouth disease outbreaks, and the Europeans, who've always eaten horse meat, increased their consumption of horse meat. And when they did that, it drew the attention of the American media, and they wondered, do we eat horses here in the United States? And when they came back and investigated, what they found is we don't eat them generally, but we process them and we ship the meat around the world. When they published that in the magazines and newspapers, there was an uproar around the country by many folks, and they stimulated their congressmen and senators to introduce legislation that would ban the processing of horses for meat. And that was the first realization in this country that we had an unwanted horse issue. We've always had horses that weren't fast enough or smart enough or couldn't jump high enough, that we took to sale barns and sold them and didn't give much thought where the horses ended up. And other than those people that were in the horse slaughter business, those horses just went away. So what complicates this issue is the American public loves horses. Whether they've ever touched a horse or been in the stall with a horse, they have a strong feeling for horses. Maybe because of our Western heritage, maybe because of the Westerns that we grew up with, but Americans like horses. Also, it's complicated by the debate over whether horses are livestock or companion animals. And those of us in the horse industry certainly think they're livestock, but the vast majority of the public thinks they're companion animals like dogs and cats. Also, the debate whether you should process and eat a horse. And around the world, there are about 5 million horses that are consumed each year. China is number one with 2.5 million horses. Mexico consumes about 800,000 horses a year. So around the world, a lot of people eat horses, but here in this country where we don't so much, there's a debate whether you should at all. Also, whenever you have an issue like this, it allows the animal activist groups to get involved, and of course it helps them with their campaigns and raising money, and so they've complicated the issue. And then this bottom chart, I don't have a pointer, but the bottom line is the population in the United States that live on ranches or farms, and the top line going up is the U.S. population. So the average American's about 3 generations off the ranch or farm. They view horses as pets, not labor or food source. Most Americans, or whether we like it or not, are moderate animal rights people. They think animals certainly have rights, and they lack livestock care knowledge. And if they drive down the road and see a horse standing in knee-deep snow, and they think, jeepers, I wouldn't want to stand in snow, so obviously that person's abusing their horse. So all of these have complicated the issue. Unwanted horses, the AAP coined the phrase, are horses that are no longer wanted by their current owner because they're old, injured, sick, unmanageable, or fail to meet their owner's expectations. In today's economy, you could add, the owner can no longer afford to keep the horse. Generally, these are old horses, horses that are incurably lame, horses that have behavioral problems, they're dangerous. We'll talk a little bit about unadoptable feral horses, Mustangs, because they certainly make up a big part of the issue. Failure to meet the owner's expectations is probably the number one reason. Either they're not pretty enough or athletic enough, or they're the wrong color, or they have no color if you're in the paint business, or they cost too much to care for. But if you go to a processing plant, and I've been to the plants here in the States before they were closed, and I've been to Canada, and I've been to Mexico, when you walk out and look at a lot of horses that are getting ready to be processed, you can see the wild ones, and you can pick out the lame ones, and you can certainly tell the old ones. But the vast majority of these horses look like the horses in your pasture or my pasture. And you wonder what brought this horse to this point in his life where it's worth $150 or $200 and it's about to be processed. How many are there is a big question. We know that there are around 50,000 horses went to Canada in 2008. We haven't seen the 2009 figures yet. Around 60,000 horses went to Mexico for processing. There are roughly 22,000 unadoptable feral horses and burros kept in BLM-funded sanctuaries. If a wild horse is captured and the horse is over the age of 10 or put up for adoption 3 times and not adopted, that horse goes into a long-term sanctuary. Most of the sanctuaries are out here in western Kansas and northern Oklahoma, and the federal government pays these folks somewhere between $475 and $500 a year to care for those horses till they die of old age. There are roughly 10,000 horses in the current adoption pipeline that are being put up for adoption around the country. In 2008, they gathered around 5,200 horses, which is down from about 10,000 the year before, and around 3,700 in 2008 were adopted, which is down from about 5,500 in 2007. But what we don't know is how many horses are standing out here in the pasture where nobody's paying much attention to them or feeding them or vaccinating them or caring for their feet and so forth. So when this whole issue started, there were a lot of things we didn't know. A lot of the breeds and disciplines were pointing fingers at each other. They thought it was not our problem, it's their problem. And we didn't know what breeds were represented, what was the age of the horses, how many were purebred or grade, what's their most recent occupation, what are they worth, who's responsible. And so since then we've gained some information. USDA figures on horses exported for processing 2001 to 2005 showed that around 70% of these horses are a Western, I don't like to call them quarter horse types because I own quarter horses. They're kind of a Western horse, you know, stocky horse. About 11% are a thoroughbred type horse. They're a tall, slim horse. Well, we know that 60% of the registered horses in this country are quarter horses. And we know that a fair number of the horses are grade that look at that type of horse. So really, the horses that end up these processing plants are not any one discipline or one breed. They pretty much represent the demographics of the horse industry. So really, it's everybody's issue. Gender-wise, 54% are mares, 41% geldings, 4% stallions. Again, that represents the demographics of the horse industry. So in 2008 and 2009, the fall of December 2008 and spring of 2009, the Unwanted Horse Coalition ran a survey to try to get our arms around the issue. We wanted to confirm that there was an unwanted horse problem because a lot of the animal activist groups will argue there's no such thing as an unwanted horse. And if we donate enough money to them, they'll certainly rescue all the horses. We also wanted to determine the magnitude of the problem and then look at ways that we could resolve it. And so we ran a web-based voluntary survey. We had around 23,000 respondents. The thing that was interesting to me was there was no difference in responses by region or district or state or part of the country. And I give a lot of talks on this issue, and the further I travel, I live about 20 miles south of here, the further I travel east and west, I see a dramatic difference in how people view this issue. But in this survey, there was absolutely no difference, which we thought was kind of interesting. There are roughly 20,000 horse owners that took the survey, 422 non-horse owners, which is kind of interesting, 60 surveys, and around 2,200 what we'd call stakeholders, and these are veterinarians, trainers, breeders, equine association staff, rescue operators, and so forth. So it's a pretty diverse group. And what we found, we asked them, do you think the number of unwanted horses is increasing? And across the board, you can see that 93 to 96% said yes, the issue was definitely increasing. If you compare that to 3 years ago, we were down in the low to mid-20s. So it's certainly escalating. Also, if you're down at the bottom, you're familiar with the problem. When we started talking about this back in 2002 or 3, and if I'd give a talk and say something about unwanted horses, absolutely nobody in the audience had a clue what we were talking about or what the issue was, or even if it was an issue. So the fact that we have a high number that are certainly aware of it is a good thing. The unwanted horse is most likely to be sold, and I'm not talking about a horse that you would sell that's a good riding horse or a potential broodmare. I'm talking about a horse that doesn't meet your needs, and you're discarding the horse. You're taking it to the sale barn and dumping it off and leaving. The horse that's most likely to be sold is a show or competition horse, usually a quarter horse paint or thoroughbred in that order, which happens to be the 3 major breeds in this country, so that's not expected. Primary reasons they did not meet their owners' expectations are usually young horses, and about half are mares and half geldings. The unwanted horse most likely to be donated, which I think is interesting, is a racehorse. A thoroughbred or quarter horse didn't meet the owner's expectations. These tend to be a little bit older horses, which is surprising. And about 63% are geldings, which is not surprising because most of the racehorses are geldings. And there's two reasons, I think, why these racehorses tend to be donated more than sold. One is some of them, by their disposition, don't make good second horses. They don't make good knock-around or recreational or roping horses or ranch horses. But also the thoroughbred industry has done a very good job of raising money and providing funds to rescue and retire racehorses. The unwanted horse is most likely to be euthanized as a recreational riding horse, usually because they have a terminal illness or they're injured, which makes sense because these horses often find, they may start out as a show horse or a race horse, and they end up as a recreational horse or knock-around horse or a horse raising kids or something like that. They tend to be a lot older, and again, they're about half mares and geldings. Stallions are seldom sold or donated, and about 75% of the unwanted horses were registered, because the unregistered population is hard to get your arms around because nobody's keeping track of these horses. So now we know that about 25% of these horses are non-registered. Contributing factors of the downturn in the economy. Again, I don't have a pointer, but if you look at this chart, it starts out in about 1960, and there's enough of you around my age in this audience to remember back in the mid-'80s when the federal government changed the tax code. And at that time, you could write off a horse if you wanted to. And then they said you have to be in the business to make money raising horses. When that happened, a huge number of investors got out of the horse business. A lot of my clients who were doctors and dentists got out quickly. And when that happened, there was a huge glut of horses on the market, and we processed about 300,000 horses in this country in the late 80s and early 90s. And you can see these are breed registration trends which dropped dramatically around 1985 and steadily increased, and then around 2005 you'll see that those registration numbers start to decrease, and they continue to decrease. So the economy is a big issue. Closing the processing plants a factor. The high cost of euthanasia and carcass disposal, based on our survey, it costs around $400 on average to euthanize and dispose of a horse carcass. About $65 to $70 of that is euthanasia cost. The rest is carcass disposal. Inability to sell horses, lack of responsible ownership where people are indiscriminately breeding horses with little thought as to what they're going to do with the horse. I mean, I know all the veterinarians in this room that have practiced have heard hundreds of owners say, we're going to breed old Dobbin to see what we get. And then the question is, well, if you don't get what you think you are going to get, what are you going to do with that foal? Something that was also kind of interesting was that owners and stakeholders had shared beliefs. That's not surprising. But non-horse owners and rescues had shared beliefs, which we thought was surprising. And the horse owners and stakeholders, because horses are a big part of their lifestyle, believe that the top contributors was closing the processing plants in the economy, and that the horse owners themselves are responsible for solving the problem. And their solutions are to reopen the plants and educate owners. The rescues and non-horse owners believe that the processing plant should never, under any circumstance, ever be reopened. The top contributors are the economy and irresponsible breeding, and that the horse associations are responsible for solving the problem. So there's a pretty serious disconnect. Something else on the rescue facilities. We don't know how many rescue, retirement, retraining sanctuaries there are in this country because there's no national organization. Some estimates we have is 332, 350, or whatever, but we're trying to determine that number, but it's very difficult because, again, what's a rescue? It could be somebody that picks up 4 or 5 horses at the sale barn and takes them home and keeps them, could call themselves a rescue. I thought it was interesting that 25% of the funding for these rescues come from the owner's personal income, which is certainly not a good way to carry on for a long period of time. 69% are at or near capacity. The maximum occupancy rate on average is about 42 horses, so if we were to multiply that out, it looks like today we could only rescue around 18,000, 20,000 horses. And traditionally we have around 100,000 horses that end up going to processing plants. Average maintenance cost for a horse is $2,300 a year, so you can see that gets expensive pretty quick. And the thing that I thought was really telling was nearly as many horses stay at the facility for life as are adopted out, so it's easy to see these facilities will fill up very quickly. Solutions are to reopen the processing plants, educate owners to breed, purchase and own responsibly, increase funding for rescue, retirement, retraining facilities, and to increase options and resources to euthanize and dispose of horses. The Colorado Unwanted Horse Alliance ran a survey among Colorado veterinarians, and frequently I hear this at meetings. People say, well, we'll just euthanize them like we do dogs and cats, and that'll be it. But in that survey in Colorado, where they surveyed about 160 horse veterinarians, they found that 68% of them would not euthanize a horse because the owner no longer wanted it. And so that's a difficult thing that I'm not so sure the veterinary community is ready to take on. Current options for unwanted horses are change of occupation. A lot of racehorses end up being hunter, jumper, dressage, event horses. Rescue, retirement, adoptions, donation to vet schools, teaching hospitals, animal science programs, although most of those are filled up in overcapacity. Euthanasia at a foreign processing plant, or neglect, abuse, turned out in the pasture, ignored, or euthanized at the owner's request. Just very briefly, I want to talk about euthanasia. There are 3 options for euthanizing a horse as approved by the American Veterinary Medical Association in 2000, and currently AVMA is reviewing these and has a panel. I serve on that panel looking at euthanasia options, but I can tell you we're not going to change these 3 options. The only thing we may do, right now, the AVMA recommends barbiturate overdose and gunshot as a last resort, but we're going to change that where all 3 of them are equally usable and advisable and acceptable. Barbiturate overdose, I suspect 99% of the horses in this country are euthanized that way. The problem with it is that there's been some research done at West Texas A&M University that shows that if you compost a horse that's been chemically euthanized, that the agent remains in the compost. A lot of the rendering plants today won't take barbiturate overdosed horses if any of the remains are going to be used for pet food, and so there's a lot of debate within the veterinary community as to whether this will be a viable option as it has been today. Gunshot certainly, in my opinion, the best way to euthanize a horse, but it's traumatic, and I can tell you that very few owners will opt for that. If they'll go to the house and leave you alone, then that's a good option, but it's very, very rare that a horse owner will opt for that. Penetrating captive bull is what's used at the processing plants here in the United States and in Mexico, the plants that we toured. In Canada, they were using gunshot to euthanize horses up there. So there's a little bit of variation. There's been some legislation to outlaw use of the penetrating captive bolt, but that legislation was aimed at the processing plant, not at individual use of horses around the country that need to be euthanized. Carcass disposal is a really big issue. The average cost, like I said earlier, is around $383. Burial, landfill, rendering, cremation, composting, biodigestion, or processed for meat. And you can read the cost. Half the states in this country do not have rendering plants. They're primarily where we have livestock production, cattle production, or swine or poultry production. So it's not available. It's probably the best option, but it's not available in a lot of areas. Burial depends on the state, the county, and the city you live near. I live 20-some miles south of here in my county, which is rural. You cannot bury a horse or a cow or a pig legally. You can drag them to the back of the property and let predators eat them, but you can't bury them. And so it varies from municipality to municipality. Composting, I think, is a great solution, but like I said, we found that the sodium pentobarbital is in the compost, and now there's research going on to see if it degrades once it's spread out on the field or it doesn't. A little bit of update on legislation affecting U.S. horse slaughter. As I said, the first legislation was introduced in 2001 by Congressman Morella in New York that was focused on the interstate transport of horses to slaughter. That bill didn't pass. Every year since then, federal legislation has been introduced on the House and Senate side. In 2006, it passed the House, but was not taken up by the Senate. Currently, the state processing plants in Illinois and Texas have been closed. An animal activist group found in 1949 Texas law that said you can't process horses and eat them in Texas, and that closed those two plants. And in 2007, there was a bill introduced in Illinois that closed that plant. So all of the horses being processed today, the unwanted horses that are being removed from the population, are being exported to Mexico or Canada. There's two or three pieces of legislation pending. One is H.R. 503, which is the Prevention of Equine Cruelty Act, that amends the Horse Protection Act to make it illegal to sell, ship, slaughter horses for human consumption. And this bill is aimed at closing the borders so the horses can't be exported outside the United States. H.R. 305 is the Horse Transportation Safety Act of 2009 that prohibits the transport of horses in double-decker trailers. In 2006, double-decker trailers were outlawed and were not allowed to transport horses to a processing plant in a double-decker trailer. And if any of you all have ever loaded horses into a pot belly or possum belly or double-decker trailers designed for cattle, and they go in the rear, they have to go up a ramp or down a ramp, and those horses stall at that point, and if they're pushed, they will jump usually, and the result is a lot of forehead lacerations and skull fractures and so forth. And back when they were transporting horses to processing plants in double-deckers, you would see a fair number of horses that had head injuries. But in 2006, that was outlawed. The problem is that you can still transport horses in double-decker trailers to an assembly point or to a feed yard or anywhere you want. You just can't transport them to the processing plant. So what a lot of the shippers do is they haul the horses across country in a double-decker, and then they unload them, and then they reload them and haul them across the border. And so that bill would make it illegal. Now, the rodeo industry hauls horses in double-decker trailers, but they're modified trailers that have straight loads to the second deck, and they're higher, so the horses have plenty of headroom, and they don't seem to have any problem with it. Last year, Senator Brownback from Kansas requested that a GAO study be conducted looking at the status of horse welfare in this country after the plants were closed, and also looking at the effect of closing the plants has had on ranch and farm income. And right now, that GAO study, initially they said it'd be done by March. Well, I talked to him yesterday, and it hasn't begun. Right now, they're still trying to develop their plan about how they're going to conduct this, because what they're finding pretty quickly is this is an extremely emotional issue, and a lot of people want to talk to them about it. And so they're trying to decide how they're going to approach this thing. And it'll be very interesting to me, because I told him yesterday and I talked to him, the tough thing is to separate closing the plants from the downturn in the economy. And you can certainly do that, but they're going to have to do a lot of homework. And based on the outcome of this study, I think will determine whether or not processing the horses for meat in this country is allowed or not. So what's this done to the horse industry? It's done a lot of things, and most of them aren't very good. It's fragmented the industry. A lot of breeds and disciplines that have different views on this issue are upset with each other and don't talk very well anymore to each other. It's lowered the price of mid to low-end horses. We know that based on some work at the American Quarter Horse Association in 2008, the average registered quarter horse that sold at a quarter horse sanctioned sale was worth around $6,800. And based on some work done by the National Ag Statistics System back in 2006, the average ranch or farm horse is worth around $2,800. Although I can tell you probably the one segment of the horse industry that's not affected by the economy and doing really well are ranch horse sales, because these are well-broke, well-trained horses that a lot of people want for roping horses and competition horses, and those horses are really holding their value. But if you go to sale barns, I once in a while drop into one up the road here at Bonner Springs. I keep track of the one at Fort Collins and a couple of them in South Dakota. There are horses selling there, and these are horses that are being discarded that sell from $23 up to $380. The $380 would be a big, fat, 1,200-pound gelding. The $23 are weanlings, yearlings, and brood mares. Weanlings, yearlings, and brood mares are being discarded quickly and bring very, very little money at these sales. There's a significant increase in the number of horses being abandoned or neglected in this country. I could list hundreds of newspaper and magazine articles discussing the issue. 69% of the rescues are full. Tremendous increase in activity by the animal activist groups, which increases their funding, raising opportunity. It increases their criticism of the horse industry, and it certainly increases their ability to lobby Congress. And last, it's drawn the attention and input of the non-horse owning public, and to many that might be a good thing. But as we talked about earlier, these folks don't know much about raising horses, but they have a strong opinion, and so there's a lot of pressure put on government officials to pass anti-slaughter legislation by people that have really nothing to do with the industry. Just a couple of things on the Unwanted Horse Coalition. Quick, this coalition was formed in 2005 because we decided in the horse industry the issue here is not horse slaughter. The issue is unwanted horses that are being discarded. And so we put together a coalition of large horse breeds and so forth to try to deal with the issue and raise awareness and educate people and develop solutions. And if you go on our website, you can see there's a lot of information about rehabilitating neglected horses. There's information about end-of-life decisions. There's a directory for rescues if you want to donate or give a horse up, and the organization's done well. I know you can't read this, but these are the organizations that are primarily involved in the Unwanted Horse Coalition, but I think by the logos you can see that this pretty much represents the horse industry in the United States. Some of the things that are being done to resolve the problem, of course, is education and responsible ownership. The Jockey Club's done a great job with a checkoff program. If you donate funds to the Jockey Club, they'll match it up to $200,000, and that money goes to the Thoroughbred Charities of America and the Thoroughbred Retirement Foundation, which helps in retraining these horses. AQHA's done a great job. You know, back, I'm not sure, I can't remember what year, I think it was 1994, something like that. There's a horse named Ferdinand that won the Kentucky Derby and ended up being sold to a Japanese horse breeder. And the horse became infertile, and they sent him to a processing plant. And that was a rallying cry across this nation by a lot of folks that that horse should not have been killed and eaten. And so AQHA has developed a greener pasture program, and this logo at the bottom is the logo that they put on registration papers. When you register a horse and sell it or transfer it, you put this logo on that horse's paper, and if the new owner ever decides, or any owner ever decides they no longer want that horse, then you have the option of either buying it back or adopting it back, which I think is a great program. They also have an exchange for horses that people want to put up for adoption. You know, the best horse for young kids to ride is an old retired horse. And so a lot of these horses are being transferred around the industry. They also have a certified horseman association that looks at horses, evaluates them, decides if they're good for alternative career. AAP's worked with the Intervet Shearing Plow to provide vaccines and so forth for rescue facilities. So there's a lot of activity going on in the horse industry that deal with the issue. So finally, whenever I give a talk, I like to remind people what we can do about this in our day-to-day lives. I think it's important that we learn the facts about the issue, and if I were to go through the whole issue in depth, it'd take me about 2.5 hours because there are a lot of things involved in it. But we need to learn the facts. We need to talk to other horse owners about it. We need to talk to non-horse owners about it, because I think the non-horse owner in this country will ultimately decide what happens to the horses and whether the legislation's passed. When we meet with senators and congressmen, first thing they tell us is, well, yeah, we understand you all know a lot about this, but we have 50 of you and we have 10,000 letters and emails from housewives around the country that have a differing view. And we have to be re-elected, so we have to pay a little bit of attention to them. I think it's also important to think, to own responsibly and think of what's in the best interest of the horse. Pause and think before we breed a horse what we're going to do with the foal if it's not what we want, and then take responsibilities for horses after we're no longer using them to perhaps euthanize them or put them down rather than take them to the sale barn and dump them off.